Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the Rethinking Cyber podcast with me, your host, Rebecca McLaughlin-Easton. Today, we are rethinking the global cyber order as cybercrime is forcing global institutions and organizations like Interpol or the International Criminal Police Organization to adjust their policing models. The COVID-19 pandemic led to accelerated rates of digitalization and work-from-home strategies for people all over the world. These factors and shifts in behavior opened up new avenues and incentives to cybercriminals to carry out multiple forms of online criminality. Indeed, Interpol's recent Global Crime Trends report revealed that ransomware plus phishing and online scams respectively ranked second and third amongst the crime trends most frequently perceived as posing high or very high threats by respondees. Moreover, the regional breakdown of these responses also placed cybercrimes amongst the top 5 crime trends identified by respondents from each respective region. Let's find out more about that research and the increasing and evolving challenges relating to cybercrime, as well as how best to tackle it. I have the perfect guest for this conversation. He is Mr. Craig Jones, the Director of Cybercrime at Interpol. Craig is an expert in the field of cyber and digital crime investigations, and he brings to the table almost 30 years of law enforcement experience. At Interpol, he focuses on operational delivery, cyber threat responses, and capabilities development for 195 member countries, and he is constantly working to shape policies that will really keep people safe and keep those cyber criminals at bay. Craig, it's great to see you. Thank you for joining me from Singapore today.
It's really good to be joining everybody on this podcast today.
Talk to me a little bit more about what Interpol as an intergovernmental organization really does, and specifically pertaining to your job, which is for one of its 3 key programs, that of making cyberspace safe for all by supporting member countries to prevent and investigate cyber attacks.
Interpol, as you say, is an intergovernmental organisation. We've been in existence now for nearly 100 years. Effectively, it's a members-based organisation of countries, and we have 195 members of Interpol. We're a neutral law enforcement body. Our main role is connecting policing for a safer world. So what we look to do is connect law enforcement regionally and globally as well, in order to counter significant crime types. And the one that I lead for Interpol as the Director of Cybercrime is our global cybercrime program, ensuring that the strategy that we've produced is in line with the overarching Interpol strategic strategy, but delivering support and coordination to member countries in combating and countering cybercrime.
Craig, to give our conversation some more context, Interpol recently held its General Assembly in New Delhi, during which time it also released its Global Crime Trends report. Talk me through the key findings of that report, and were there any surprises?
I've just recently been at our General Assembly in New Delhi. This is the first, what I would call, full in-person General Assembly since 2019, so almost 4 years, in fact. This is where the countries came together to discuss various major issues that are impacting globally around cybercrime, but also about how Interpol manages its own governance. Now, this year was the first time Interpol has launched a Global Crime Trends report. Now, this report was built through inputs from our member countries, but also private sector. I suppose one of the points within that and some of the main trends was actually some of it wasn't a surprise. What was a surprise was what came out in the sort of top areas of potential priorities, or the crime types that were presenting a high or very high threat. For the first time, what we saw there was the prevalence of cybercrime within such a global report produced by a law enforcement agency. We saw ransomware, phishing, and online scams, they were ranked really, really high in the sort of top 5. And this was across all of our regions. So this is across 4 regions as well. And again, this is slightly surprising because we know cybercrime is underreported in policing. But when you also now compare this to some of the figures that we have at Interpol in terms of our red notices, which are sort of reports of wanted people or tracing people who are involved in certain crime types. So when we look at your commodity-based crimes, such as drugs, terrorism, things like that, they're pretty high. The cybercrime red notices are a very, very small percentage of our red notices. So the things I'm drawing out from that is you could say, well, actually, there's not a lot of cyber criminals out there because we don't have a lot of reports or red notices out for them. But actually, conversely, you turn that around and say, well, if it's ranking up there as a high threat, what currently is going on globally in the policing environment in order to identify and prosecute these offenders, because that is a transnational crime type, which impacts all countries globally.
Tell me exactly how geographies across the world have been affected by cybercrime, not least in the wake of the global pandemic. From your findings in the report, how did the responses vary between different regions?
What we're able to do is sort of, if going to generalize, is cyber criminals are profit driven. So they are like any crime type. They are after the money effectively. That's the normal type that we're looking at in the crime area. So we look at it then where we might have individual cyber criminals that are just doing it on a small basis, but actually they can in fact cause a very high harm and high impact depending on what they're doing and how they're operating. But we've also seen this move, and it's been widely reported, Trend Micro, a company as well that picked it up, is that business as a service model for cyber criminals. So effectively, they've now created this market, and the market is such like any normal business market. It is there to drive a business for profit on a return on an investment. So we look at that traditional cyber crimes, and we look at the deployment of malware. We've seen that has dramatically escalated, and the ransomware attacks, and certainly we're seeing now ransomware attacks being directed. We've seen those sort of big game hunting where they're going after big companies. But what happens when the criminals go after big companies is they then start attracting a lot of attention, and they attract attention from governments, from law enforcement, from cybersecurity agencies. So we're also seeing a shift then with the cyber criminals where they've maybe going to the mid-tier market, where the risk is not so great of potentially being caught or identified, and the returns are still pretty good on what they're doing.
Let's drill a little bit deeper into the specific ways in which you and your organisation are really rethinking the global cyber order and how cybercrime has been policed to date.
And I think that the geopolitics around cybercrime can't be ignored. We're looking at the policing model is constructed in a local way. You have the crime, you have the offender, you have the victim, you have the scene. It all takes place normally in a localized area. It's not, as we know, in a cybercrime, but policing is still set up in that localized model. And there's a siloed model to this as well. We also have the other aspect where we have the underreporting of cybercrime. So it's very hard on a policing on a national, regional level to try and get budgets and have that prioritized if it's not being reported. We see in some reports that cybercrime or online crime is effectively over 50% of reported crime now. So if you then look at potential figures that aren't reported, it's higher than that effectively. So the first part is how is policing and what's that model going to look like going forward? We've got to break away from this siloed model, but we also have that layer of geopolitics added on top of it. So when we look at how we rethink this, the first part is that aggregation of data sets. And in order to do that, we've got to develop a trust model. How do we effectively trust when we're sharing data and information? Because we are not sharing the data effectively at the moment between law enforcement agencies globally. We might be doing it regionally, we might be doing it in those bilaterals or those microlaterals where you might have 4, 5, 6, 7 countries, but effectively they are then not able to impact on where the infrastructure or where the criminals are. So what Interpol is trying to do is to bring together that data and information, start those operations, start those investigations with lead agencies and countries, and then look to help support and facilitate those operations in terms of prevention, detection, investigation, and disruption. So again, we're looking at a policing model on a global scale, and it's right across all of our different business areas and our crime types that we have here at Interpol.
As you underlined, the key word here is, of course, trust. And being cognizant of the fact that collaborating, building trust and sharing information with member countries and private sector partners in the IT security industry, it has to be said, is so critical to understanding the nature, the scope and the scale of cyber threats. My question to you would be, how easy has this been for Interpol to do? How have you gone about securing that support and knowledge sharing?
So we have to have a very strong strategy, and the strategy is there to produce an outcome. So effectively, for our global cybercrime strategy, the aim is to reduce the global impact of cybercrime and protect communities for a safer world. It's about prevention, it's about protection of life and property. We then look about how and where we work in each area. So I've already mentioned about the 4 key areas for us are prevention, detection, investigation, and disruption. Now, historically, policing could do all 4 of those virtually on their own in the community. They could manage to prevent crime, they could detect crime, they could investigate, and they could disrupt through judicial outcomes. When we move out online, it all changes. So we have to look about where and who holds the data sets. How do we prevent the crime taking place in the first instance? So the onus there is on the private sector who, develop the new tools, the new software, things like that. Do we look at security design? Do we look at security by default? Those sort of things. So again, we have to develop that in different ways. We also look at then that demand. We're looking at a volume crime type here, which has high harm, high impact globally. So nationally, you are not going to be able to deal with that effectively. You also then look at that high volume crime type, which may have a low impact. And in terms, it might not be low on an individual or a business that's effective, but when you aggregate it across the world, that then becomes real high volume crime types. So how do we then coordinate to facilitate that? Now, Interpol, we have a really strong relationship with private partners. We are able to receive data and information from selected private partners under Interpol's rules of processing data. Then we look to turn that into actionable intelligence, being able to then draw the law enforcement with ourselves and the private partners together to look at actual operations where the criminals have been identified. How can we then manage to take the victim statements in another country and then prosecute the threat actors and the criminals in the country where they're operating So we can then go into those countries with the law enforcement agencies of the countries. The law enforcement agencies carry out the arrests and they will carry out the prosecutions. So again, the policing model remains the same there, where we look to identify the criminals in the communities, but then also judicial outcomes, disrupt them actually in their community. So we demonstrate to the communities that we are able to protect them from harm wherever the criminals are operating from. We also have Atlas. Now, Atlas is a project which has been designed with ourselves, the World Economic Forum, and a number of international private entities. And that's where private entities have come together themselves. And us, as Interpol, have given them a problem set. We've said, well, look, here's 4 crime types: ransomware, business email compromise, network intrusion, regarding forums. They're looking at who are the 4 main groups or organizations, criminal organizations involved in that, and then overlaying that information. They're then able to share that information with us and other partners as well. We can then look to then develop new operational activities and actionable intelligence, which we give to law enforcement in countries, and we help coordinate and facilitate those operations going forward.
Let's talk a little bit about cybercrime and conflict, because organised crime will often take advantage of the uncertainty and the shift in focus, if you like, during a conflict, as we've referenced. And I think it's important to be clear again, as we've talked about throughout our conversation, whilst Interpol does remain a neutral organisation, politically, racially, religiously and militarily, it can shed light on the situation relating to Russia and Ukraine at present. So what can you tell us about the level of supervision and monitoring, for example, when it comes to cybercrime right now relating to that conflict?
Okay, you just quoted Interpol's Article 3 very nicely there. It's about maintaining our neutrality. We are only involved in matters where they have a crime nature to, effectively. However, we do have a responsibility to all 195 member countries, whatever the situation is being faced in countries and between countries. And that took up quite a lot of conversation pre the General Assembly and during the General Assembly as well. We have certain rules that we have in place that our member countries have to adhere to. We look at the criminals in this, and they do take advantage of uncertainties. We've seen how it worked during the pandemic. Again, it's now shifted during the conflict, and we've seen groups which have now said that they are working on behalf of the state or the near state. And then we might have some heightened supervision and monitoring measures in place, such as you've seen with Russia. And our Secretary General made a very clear statement around how we're working with the National Central Bureau of Moscow, how they have to, and how we look at their diffusions and notices, how we check and ensure they're compliant with Interpol rules. And likewise with Ukraine as well. So we look to do this fairly, we look to do this and very transparently.
Shifting now to technology, we know that it's at the beating heart of cybercrime, and given the speed and sophistication at which it is evolving, and the agility of criminals to continually adapt their tactics and approaches, where are we headed, I guess, is the question. And will the conversation have moved on should we meet again in 12 months' time? Will we be keeping pace better with technology and indeed the cyber criminals?
The criminals are very quick to seize on new opportunities, to try out the latest tools, techniques, procedures, those sort of things, and then try and implement those into their business model. When we see more reliance on information and communications technology, there is this catch-up process that governments, law enforcement agencies have to do. And sometimes it can take us a little bit longer because of the safeguards and rules that are imposed on us, the laws and the legislations. We then look at the private sector about, how do we design systems and networks that are more secure? How do we reduce those vulnerabilities? And that comes back into the work that we're doing around our strategy for prevention, detection, investigation, and disruption. But also on the flip side of that, we can use technology. Some simple things, such as we now have a collaborative platform for sharing operational information and data between member countries. So when we start an operation, we'll produce or give access to a platform and a workspace to the countries and the private partners that are working specifically on that case. Now, this didn't exist 12, 24 months ago. So we're now developing new tools, new platforms, working with the private sector as well. When we look at our innovation center here in Singapore, they're forward-looking, horizon scanning, looking at what's out there technology-wise that may either assist policing in the future or actually impact communities, and there may be the harm in that. So certainly AI is one that's featuring very, very strongly at the moment.
If we do understand that prevention and early reduction of vulnerabilities is essential to winning this war on cybercrime, where will your efforts, where will Interpol be looking and directing their focus in the near and medium term?
I think historically we were very focused on capability and capacity building for member countries, which makes great sense. But we've sort of flipped that now. So we're very much now going towards how do we help regions create regional operation desks and having staff attached or seconded to Interpol as part of that regional model. Building that trust within that regional model, within Interpol platforms and systems is absolutely critical to this. So some of this is sort of 10, 15, 20 years time forward looking, where we lay the groundwork now, we set out the principles, we then ensure that we embed those principles, those tools, those practices. But then we have to have an evidence base. And I'll give you an example. 3 years ago, we had a meeting. We had about 15 heads of cybercrime units from Africa. We had a very fruitful meeting discussion. Now, We have an African cybercrime operations desk. We have staff embedded in our regional bureaus in Africa, specifically for cybercrime, seconded officials, specialized officers. We're providing data and information from our cybercrime threat response hub here in Singapore with our private partners. We identified threat actors in Nigeria that were operating business email scams, other online and cybercrime activities. We work with countries where we identified there were victims from this organised crime group. We then brought everybody together. Nigeria took the lead on that. They identified free criminals and other organised crime networks within areas of Nigeria and carried out disruption by arresting people, seizing assets, seizing vehicles, things like that. Now, that wouldn't have previously happened in the level that we had done. And we're moving that model out across America's region. Within Europe, you already have a very strong European Cybercrime Centre. So we're looking about how we can work more effectively with them. How can we work more effectively with countries where the infrastructure or the criminals are?
Surely that points to teamwork and collaboration at their absolute best, Craig. Lastly, let me ask you, what top tips would you give people looking to protect themselves, their families, and their businesses from cybercrime? Additionally, what should people do if they also have information relating to something that they suspect could be criminal cyber activity?
Most of us have, the phones in our hand 24/7. So think about, do you know what's on your phone? Do you know the apps? Do you know you've downloaded those from a reliable source effectively? Do you keep your software and operating systems up to date? When you get those annoying little messages and you think, oh, I'll put that off, I'll do it later. Do you actually click on it? And also antivirus, that's the sort of standard. I think for businesses, I'm going to keep it really simple. Plan, prepare and practice. And what I mean by that is, as highlighted on our crime trend report, we saw ransomware right up there at the top. So I suspect lots of companies have got fantastic business continuity plans for all sorts of things. I expect companies have planned what would happen if there was a ransomware attack. I expect they've prepared for it as well. But ask, have they practiced? Have they carried out drills? And also it's that board level or high level management that has to be involved in this, because there's fantastic people working in companies that have great ideas and want to support the business as well. But is that running right through the spine of your organization, from the data inputter role right up to that chief executive? Is everybody understanding and seeing what their roles and responsibilities are in the organization to help protect that organization?
Prevention is indeed key. Craig, it's been fantastic talking to you. Such an interesting topic, but sadly, we need to leave our conversation there. Thank you again for your time. And just before you go, for those listening and watching all around the world who would like to find out more about your organization, the work it does, and also your role, where should they go to?
Where wouldn't you head? Effectively, go online, www.interpol.int. That will take you directly onto our website. But if you type in Interpol and certainly cybercrime, because I'll push that one, we've got our own space on our website as well.
Superb. Thank you again, Craig, and we'll see you on the ground very soon in Saudi Arabia.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and thanks to everybody for listening.
And a big thank you also to our listeners and our viewers from all around the world. To find more episodes and interviews of this kind, just head to Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you normally access your podcasts from. And so, on behalf of myself and the entire Global Cybersecurity Forum team, thank you again for being with us today. We hope you'll join us again next time for more in-depth conversations. Until then, take care and